Today we're joined by Nick Tulloch from the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. If you want to give us a brief introduction to yourself.
Of course. Well, it was certainly a pleasure to meet you both. As you just said, I'm the candidate for the Scottish Conservatives and Unionists in Shetland in the election that's coming up next week. I have to say it was a real pleasure to be asked. I've been on the candidates list for the Scottish Conservatives for around about 7 years now, although this is my second election. The previous one I stood in Inverness. Shetland's an area that's always interested me because I can trace my family back to Shetland, back to the 1700s. And so as locations go to stand in elections, I felt a real affinity with the area, so I was absolutely delighted.
So our first question to you is, as it looks like we are coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, what ideas do you have on how to help young people benefit from the recovery process?
I spent most of my life working in finance or business, and so I tend to look at things very much from more of an economist point of view rather than a politician's point of view. And I can't envisage a time in my lifetime where I've seen such an acute and challenging crisis, not only to the economy, but also to our personal health and well-being. So the two things that really stand out for me are first of all, creating sustainable jobs. Any country is always going to thrive on the success of its private sector. And as individuals and communities, we're going to thrive if communities are well engaged and well employed. So I feel very strongly that as we come out of these, really sort of extraordinary, and people keep using the word unprecedented, but this extraordinary, unprecedented time, we do need to find a way to rebuild the economy quickly and support businesses, both big and small, for their future hiring and expansion plans. And that means, in many cases, providing state support for those businesses, and in turn, encouraging those businesses to support younger people and recruit younger people. The second area I mentioned is our own health and well-being. When I'm not involved in politics, I'm involved in a health and wellness company, and I feel very strongly that one of the areas I think has been overlooked for much of this pandemic is our own mental health and our own feelings about how some of the isolation, the lockdown, the restrictions have impacted us. As a party policy, the Scottish Conservatives want to increase spending on mental health from 8% to 10%. And I think that's important as we begin to recognise that it's no longer a taboo subject to talk about mental health. This is something that should be front and centre. Many of us, it is a fact that many of us will go through mental health challenges during our lifetime. And I think it's hard to imagine a time, other than the last 12 months, that we've had more affronts to our mental well-being. So keeping mental health high on the agenda and supporting, not only our young people, but all of our population, I think should be essential for all politicians, irrespective of the party.
Following on with the COVID, I guess the next question we have is, many people say that our generation of young people may become the lost generation. What can your party offer young people to prevent that?
So going back to what I said a moment ago, I do want to see businesses supported and encouraged and enabled to increase recruitment. I always felt very privileged when I left school and then left university that I was able to get a job relatively quickly. It was a job that was prepared to train me. I started out my career as a lawyer, and I always felt my employer invested far more in me than I invested in them. So I would like to see all employers put in a position to repay that and to repay the experience that I had. And that means, from a government point of view, providing better funding for businesses, but also providing faster funding. And I think one of the challenges businesses have had during the course of the pandemic is just the uncertainty. Grants and support are well advertised by governments on both sides of the border, but it's been very difficult for businesses to actually access that funding. And if you can't access the funding, it's very difficult to convince yourself as a business that you should employ people. But I'd like to see faster and more certain funding, and I would like to see it angled towards the younger generation. there are some quite imaginative schemes already available in Scotland, and there's something called the No One Left Behind scheme that is particularly aimed at under 24-year-olds. Which the business I work for has employed 2 people already on that scheme, and I think that type of thing, but with greater certainty. That's limited to 2 people per year per company, by the way. That's nowhere near enough. You know, we should be looking at providing greater support and greater opportunity for young people, because after all, I know again it's a cliche, but after all, this is very much our future. And if we don't train and support the younger generation, I mean, bluntly, who will look after us in our retirement? Who will be the future taxpayers? Who will be the future doctors? Who will be the future teachers? So, you know, rather like my comment on mental health, I think it's an enormous opportunity and a compelling opportunity for government to make sure that the younger people, you know, in Scotland, in Shetland, right across the United Kingdom, get the opportunities as many of us did when we were in that position some years ago, get the opportunities to get good jobs, to be trained, and to go on and have successful and fulfilling careers.
Definitely, and then pass on the experiences that the generation before have had as well.
It's true, you know. We were talking about Zoom calls earlier. I learned far more as a young professional by sitting quietly in a meeting, watching my superiors behave in particular situations, behave with clients, behave on, you know, in meetings, behave with you know, on drafting contracts or writing letters. I learned far more watching than I did actually by attending lectures at university. And I think people will miss a lot by participating in work through Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams. Yeah, I think we need to find a way to bring these restrictions to an end a little bit faster than is currently proposed. I'm not suggesting we do anything dangerous. I mean, our health has to be paramount. But if the evidence shows, and it does, that we can end the restrictions sooner, let's get people back meeting each other. Let's get people back into the workforce, you know, and let's continue to build this recovery.
Definitely. And the third question, if you were First Minister for a day, what policies or laws would you bring in?
I spent part of the last few years before lockdown working for a company that was based in Colorado over in the US. And something I saw there that I was very impressed with, I wouldn't have said this a few years ago, but they legalized cannabis, they legalized marijuana. And what I've learned, and what's interesting about Colorado is it has an almost identical population to Scotland. Now, Colorado legalized marijuana, and almost overnight, they closed down organized crime. They essentially cut off the funding supply for organized crime. They created a very substantial business that itself created a large number of jobs. You drive through most towns in Colorado and they have cannabis dispensaries. That in itself has produced a very significant amount of tax for the state. Last year, Colorado did $2 billion of sales of cannabis, so about £1.5 billion. If Scotland would do that, that would be a terrific tax benefit for Scotland. Tax revenue that could be spent on improving health services, improving education, improving roads. You know, the list goes on. But at the same time, cutting legs off organised crime. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should be sort of walking up and down the street smoking pot. I mean, that's absolutely not the right image. But what they've done over in Colorado is they've kept it within people's homes and within licensed dispensaries, very much as you might go to an off license. And I think it's been a tremendous success. And I think the world is heading in that direction. And so here's an opportunity for Scotland to be right at the forefront of the world. And so if I had 24 hours in the in Bute House, that's certainly something I'd push for.
Our next question is, what were your main interests as a young person yourself?
Well, they varied considerably according to my age and mood. I was never very good at it, but I always quite enjoyed sport, and I was particularly fond of rugby, although I always felt I was far too tall and thin to make a real impact on the game. I have to say, as I sort of got into my teens, I probably became just as interested in girls as I did in rugby. But I never really lost that interest in sport, and just passion for running around and being part of something healthy. I was brought up in a country with very limited green space. I was brought up in Hong Kong, and in my first school, our playground doubled as the football pitch, doubled as I think the basketball court, and it was basically just a sheet of tarmac. And so when I eventually came back to the United Kingdom, being able to have green spaces to engage in sport was something that I really did appreciate.
I think that's a big thing that we have in this country. We have the ability to have all these green spaces for all our young people and all the older people as well to enjoy.
It's so true, and we underestimate it. I mean, yeah, kind of back to mental health. We underestimate the benefit we have in this country. I know, I mean, Scotland is regularly voted as one of the most beautiful countries in the world, but just the ability to walk out of our front doors and have green spaces around us to engage in whatever we choose to do, whether it's, in my case, rugby or cycling, but running or various other activities. I think it's a tremendous privilege, and we shouldn't forget it, despite the weather.
That's the biggest threat to outdoor activity. And the next question, do you think the UNCRC right to the child should be in Scots law and in local law at a council level too?
I absolutely do. So they are in Scots law as of middle of March, but absolutely. And I mentioned earlier, I always feel very privileged that my own upbringing gave me a number of opportunities, and I just do not think that any of us should forget that many people are not so fortunate. And I think it's a responsibility for all of us, whether we're in national or local government, or parents or friends or relatives, to put the health and welfare of all of our children absolutely front and centre. I mean, it's well publicised that Nicola Sturgeon said, "Judge me on her record in education," which has I think been to no one's liking. If maybe back to your previous question about what I would do if I was First Minister, I would put far more of the country's budget into education, into childcare, into child welfare. I was at a seminar some years ago, nothing to do with politics, when an individual talked about some of the policies he would like to see put in place in the country. And one of his comments, which has stuck with me, is that he would overinvest in education. And that's a phrase that I've really held on to. I don't think it's possible to overinvest in education. I mean, this is the future of all of us in the country. It's the future of our young people, and it's the future of our old people. And I don't think education or child welfare should ever be a rounding number in the budget. It should be the first item down on the page. So in terms of children's rights right across the board, I think they need to be protected at every level, national, local, and even down to the families.
Yeah, the Scottish Youth Parliament is what me and Leighton are part of. Like, it's a fundamentally rights-based organisation, and we had these campaigns for the UNCRC to be incorporated into Scots law, and obviously that process continues. Our next question is on climate change. With Glasgow hosting the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, how do you and your party plan on reducing the impact we all have on climate change?
I think, there's always a lot of temptation to say we should be swapping fossil fuels for renewable energy, and that should be the be-all and end-all policy. I think that's part of the story. I think as time goes on, we need to be diversifying away from fossil fuels, but not to the extent where it compromises livelihoods, compromises jobs, compromises our own way of living. Better still, we should be reducing our reliance on fossil fuels by making buildings more efficient. So better use of insulation, better building construction, triple glazing maybe rather than double glazing. We should be increasing the use of electric cars. I've been driving an electric car for the last 6 months, and I absolutely love it. But one of the big restrictions I have is I can only really charge it at home. There are very, very few charging points. It's not like going to a petrol station. If we're going to have better use of electric cars and in turn reduce our reliance on gasoline and diesel, we need to have more charging points. And I think that a big thing that's missing from government policy, and I'd say it's on both sides of the border, is this general aspiration. We're going to stop sales of petrol cars, we're going to stop sales of diesel cars. Terrific, but we need to put in a viable plan for the alternative, and that is more charging points. One of the clever things I think Shetland has done is to produce a charging point powered by the sea. And I think we should be looking at more of those, especially in island nations, not just for car charging, but right across the power generation capability that we require as a country. I think the other big thing that's missing is education, education on climate change, and making people really understand what matters, why it matters. And this is not a sort of a frenzied pitch from a member of the Green Party. You know, we need constructive and applied education to individuals to show them that what they do can actually make a difference. You know, right down from recycling in your own kitchen to maybe changing the way, you know, changing the type of car you use, thinking about how buildings are constructed. We should be thinking about how we reduce our energy requirement, as well as changing the way that energy is actually generated.
Yeah, they speak of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, and everybody goes on about recycling. But if we take the first R, reduce, then we'll maybe start to see a proper change.
I think we really will, and yeah, as modern houses become better insulated and require less in the way of energy to heat them in this country or other countries to cool them, you know, one of the biggest contributors to, you know, the UK's I suppose fossil fuel output are heating and powering our own homes. So let's have more efficient homes. You know, let's give people and let's give local councils the ability to help, you know, our constituents and our residents to improve the energy efficiency of our homes. It's not going to happen overnight, but over a period of time, that is the single best way to reduce our energy requirement.
So the next question we have is what are the key things you wanted to change about the place you grew up?
Well, I've already mentioned that I grew up in Hong Kong, which could barely be any more different from Shetland. Barely any more different from Scotland as a whole, actually. I mean, Hong Kong was a terrific place, and you know, I would you know, certainly not want to change my upbringing. But you know, what we craved was green spaces, clean air, less overcrowding. You know, all of the things that I love and enjoy so much about Scotland. So yeah, there were many positive things. Yeah, the weather was great, had nice beaches, but you know, finding a space to sit and, you know, finding unpolluted seas was always a bit of a challenge. And you just got used to it. I remember as a child, you know, if you walk down the beach, you'd just expect to be standing on plastic bags and polystyrene and, you know, everything else that got washed up in the sea. And that was just a fact of life. But knowing what I know now, I think there would have been better ways of handling that.
Definitely such a contrast from like Shetland.
It honestly, it couldn't be much different. And I mean, I suppose Hong Kong. I left Hong Kong 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago, and of course the populations just continue to grow and industries continue to grow. But as I say, I have very, very fond memories of it. I don't want to change my upbringing, but I think Hong Kong could have been, you know, could have been cleaner and greener, and, you know, maybe made better use of the space it did have.
We've got another sort of fun question coming up here. If you could have a dinner party with 3 people who are alive or dead, who would they be and why?
Well, I've got of the 3 I've got, 2 are alive. One is not. I've never met her, but I'd like to meet Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who, as a politician or as a global politician, is the person that in the last 3 or 4 years has really stood out to me as the most impressive leader of any of the countries that I particularly follow. I thought the way that she's handled COVID, the way that she handled the terrorist attack, the earthquake, I mean, she's had a number of challenges thrown at her, and I think she's approached them with extraordinary dignity, compassion, empathy, and leadership. And I think to get all of those things right as a single package is truly extraordinary. You know, and I frankly don't think that anyone in the UK has matched that combination. So I'd be absolutely fascinated to meet her. I think she's done an amazing job. I suppose on a slightly more fun note, I would like to meet George. I think his middle initials are RR, but George Martin, the person who wrote Game of Thrones. I used to do quite a bit of traveling, and I read all the Game of Thrones books long before I saw the TV program. I thought the books were wonderful. They sort of came to a sort of shuddering halt around about sort of book 5 or 6, I think. But I felt the way the TV adaptation finished was sort of slightly out of kilter with the books, and I'd just be fascinated to ask him, is that really his plan? Is he, did he just get bored of writing it and decide to bring it to a very quick end, or was there something else? And then the third one is someone who's passed away. That would actually be my great-grandfather. I mentioned that I have family from Shetland. In the early 1900s, around about I think 1905, my great-grandfather, whose name was George, left Fetler. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he was called to Australia, and he eventually settled in Queensland and then thereafter Western Australia. And we spoke about the contrast between Hong Kong and Shetland a moment ago. I think for someone in the early 1900s to have the confidence to leave Fetler and go and settle in Australia, I mean, that was probably the equivalent if you can't get two more different places. But he married, he raised a family, and as you probably gathered, some of the family then returned back to Scotland. But clearly I never met him, but I'd be fascinated to know what his experiences were in making that move.
Sounds like a very, very interesting night, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of stories about the long sailing trip from Bettler all the way to Australia.
I'm not sure how much the three would have in common, but I would enjoy myself anyway.
So the next one is, if you get elected to represent Shetland, will you promise to work with the members of the Scottish Youth Parliament?
Absolutely, I'd be absolutely fascinated to. I really would. I think it's brilliant what you guys are doing, and I would love. Well, I'm obviously too old, but I'd love to be part of it. I'd love to be part of the conversation. It wasn't just words before. I feel so strongly that as a country and as a nation, we need to engage far more with our young people. I always felt very fortunate in my career that from time to time my superiors would turn to me and say, "So Nick, what do you think?" Which was always a terrifying moment, but at least they gave me the benefit of asking my opinion. And I know as I've gone through life that how I look at things can be quite different at different ages, and what's important to you in your 20s can be feel quite different in your 30s or 40s, as I am now. And I think very often as people we underestimate the experience and the perspective of younger people. And as I said before, you guys are the people who'll be looking after us in our old age, and so if we don't start talking to you now, we've left it way too late.
We've been obviously working with like current MSPs and previous MSPs, and in our roles as MSYPs being politically impartial, we feel like is really helpful to represent the young people between the ages of 12 and 25 in Shetland to the decision makers. Our last question is, why should young people in Shetland vote for you?
People should vote for me because I represent the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, and we represent hope. We represent a party that wants to improve the country and generate jobs and generate incomes and improve welfare and improve our standards of living. I have seen 14 years of the SNP in government, in which during those 14 years they've behaved more like the party in opposition. And they've made an art form of telling us all what we should be worried about and whose fault it is. But what I've seen is declining standards of education. I've seen problems with transport, problems with our health service. The list goes on. I don't think it does any country any good whatsoever to have a party in charge who is more interested in telling you about the problems. We need to have people in charge who are interested in telling you about the future and how we can improve that future. And the policies that we, our party, have set out are very much about improving our livelihoods, rebuilding our communities, not focusing on some crazy constitutional division, which will tear our country apart, very much as we sort of provoked arguments back in 2014, but focused on a recovery and focused on a sustained recovery beyond that. So supporting businesses, supporting jobs, supporting education, which, as you probably gathered, is something I feel very strongly about. I have 2 young children, so that really matters to me. Creating good quality healthcare for all. This is what the Scottish Conservatives stand for, and this is certainly what I would stand for if I'm elected.
Thank you so much for talking to us tonight, and we wish you the best of luck with the election.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, thank you both for making the time, and yeah, I really enjoyed meeting you, and I'll hopefully see you again sometime.